Good evening, grace and peace be multiplied unto you. Thank you so much for those of you who are getting logged in for this Walking Through the Word Bible class. Thank you so much for being a part of what God is doing for us. Thank you to our intercessors tonight. Thank you for your prayers, and we certainly appreciate you covering us as well. Thank you, those of you who are getting logged in, those Hill Watchers. We certainly appreciate you getting logged in with us. Thank you, and good evening to each of you. Good evening to you, Sister Boykins. Good evening, Sister Randall. Thank you so much for getting logged in and hanging out with us for what will be 30 minutes of teaching. We certainly appreciate your presence on tonight. Thank you again to all of you who continue to support ministry and make ministry go. When we were together last week, we looked at Paul's letter to Paul's first missive to the church at Corinth, chapter 3, and I want to journey back in that direction again on this evening. Again, thank you so much for those of you who are gathered in person, and then those of you who are watching virtually. Thank you so much. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3 is where we want to study from tonight. We looked at last week, for those of you who were with us, we looked at last week. I got to remember I'm on camera. I'm like this reaching. We looked at last week spirituality, carnality, and kind of what drove Paul's letter, chapter 3, to Corinth, and him talking about babes in Christ and their growth or their lack thereof of growth. We talked about that from a standpoint of spiritual, just kind of stagnation, of Paul not being able to share with them the meat of the matter, and he was still given unto them milk because of their mindset, or he calls them babes, so that we can conclude as well, because of their level of immaturity. He wanted them to have it. He wanted them to grasp it, but that was a problem. Their way of thinking, their carnality. Paul uses the emphasis of that. He said, well, why I want to see you develop to a place of maturity. So you've got to want to, right? He said, you have to want to, right? And if you don't want to, it's hard to give you that which you're going to resist. And even though it may be good for you, if you reject it, you'll never see the good in it. And he says, so I can't, he says, so I'm treating you like babes. What did we say about carnality and how it can stagnate the growth of believers? Is that carnal thinking is that you operate from the place of flesh. It's where you operate, and so how you respond, how you first face circumstances, and how you deal with them, you operate from the place of flesh. And so Paul says, I'm struggling to try to reach you because of your fleshly thinking, and it has driven you to a place of carnality, and he identifies them as being babes in Christ, right? We talked about that in that level of stagnation. He went on to, if we follow 1 Corinthians chapter 3, and if you follow kind of the verses to follow, he goes on to say, here is how I know you are carnal. I need you to note this tonight and make sure you grab it. Here's how I know you're carnal. It's because your efforts are always or too many times consistent on whose side you're going to be on. He said, the problem I have and the problem that we're struggling with at the church at Corinth, this is important, people of God. He says, I can recognize your carnality based upon you being so gung-ho to pick a side, right? And the fact, listen to this, the fact that there's a side available, watch this, suggests that there is no unity, but there is division. And so Paul says, here's how I know you're not at a place, a mature place, because if you were at a mature place, you would not try to further the divide, but you'll try to eliminate the divide, right? And a good way to eliminate the divide is not to say whose side I'm on, but to say, what can we do that's in alignment with the principles and the precepts of the Word of God that will bridge us what? Together. Does that make sense? And so Paul says the struggle with your carnality is that you're so busy trying to find a side. I know it to be true because the writer says, they said, who then is Paul and who is Apollos? Both, but ministers, this is verse number 5, I'm sorry. But ministers by whom ye believe, even as the Lord gave to every man. And so they're getting caught up in who's Paul, who's Apollos. Why? Because what they're trying to do is they're trying to take sides, right? And I believe one of the hindrances of the church and why she has not been able to thrive in her rightful place is because there are too many sides. And how do you develop too many sides? Well, you develop too many sides based upon carnal people. Because carnal people only can see themselves as what they want, how they feel, and how they think it should be. And so when carnality drives the environment, you can never have a connection. You can only have division. Because the reality is how I feel may be different than how you feel. And what happens is if I'm so carnal that I'm suffocated with how I feel, I can never take into consideration anybody else's feelings. So guess what happens? We create a what? Yep. And so while the church needs to get to a certain place and needs to be more active in our community, needs to do more work, how can we accomplish that when the church is full of people who operate from one place, and that's a place of carnality? And so everybody trying to see who's going to be on my team, right? I like them, so I'm going to be on that team. I don't like them, so I'm going to find the people who don't like them so I can be on that team, right? It's unfortunate, but it takes place in Christendom. And while weightier matters are facing us, we can't deal with those because we have no unity. And why don't we have unity? Because we have too much carnality. Does that make sense? And so Paul says, I'm struggling because you're wondering who is Paul, who's Apollos. And he says, God says, look, I created them both, and I'm responsible for what they carry. They are my ministers. Right? And what if, this is an if, what if instead of us seeing and focusing on the differences that each of us possess, what happens if we focused on the abilities that each of us possess? What if I do something well, and instead of you trying to tear down what I do well, that you support what I do well, right? And then when you do something well, guess what? I support what you do well. And all of a sudden in the environment, we have a bunch of people who are doing a lot of things well. Right? And so our abilities and our differences should never divide us unless we approach them with carnality. They actually should bring us together. They should bring us together. And Paul, when he writes to the church at Corinth, he says, this is the issue. He says, because I got to get you to a place. He says, I got to get you to a place. I can't have you operating in carnality. I have to get you to a place. And here's why. He says, because in verse number 9, 1 Corinthians chapter 3, right? Verse number 9. Lord have mercy. Satan, you're a liar. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse number 9. Right? First Corinthians chapter 3, verse number 9. Look what it says. Do you have it? This is what the text says. For we, you see it? Are laborers together with who? With who? We are laborers together with God, right? And so if that's the case, right? If that's the case, if I am laboring based upon God's assignment and God's call, right? How then is it that we're not connected and we have division? Think about this. If we are laborers together, right, with God, you are, I am, we are laborers together with who? With God. How can we be laborers together with God and we are divided in the God place? Make it make sense to me. We claim that we are laborers together with God, but in the God place, there are no connections. You know why? Because you can't be a laborer with God if you are carnal. And so it's not that God is not trying to move. It's just that it's difficult for him to move when you have an environment full of what? When you have an environment full of what? Carnal people. He said we're laborers together with God. Watch what he describes in verse number 9. You still with me? He says we're laborers together with God, right? Which should automatically eliminate division, right? Notice how Paul strategically starts by trying to eliminate the division based upon who should be the very source of why we should be together. Because you've got to find a reason to connect despite the fact that you're different. Oh. And what Paul does, he says, here is your connection just in case you want to try to remain divided and you can't find a reason to connect. He says, let me help you. We are laborers together with who? That is our what? Talk back to me. It's Bible class. That is our what? That if you say it, it'll make you know it and then you can practice it, right? We are connected as a result of who? At the minute that the church loses the focus of its connection, it ceases to be relevant. I'll say it to you again. You got to hear me tonight. The minute that the church loses its focus of the source that brings us all together, the church ceases to be relevant. And is it possible that we've lost our relevance because we've ignored God? Oh, gosh. Every time we take him out of the equation, we put ourselves where he's supposed to be, and then therefore we can't come together because the source of our connection is out the equation. You know how easy it is for me to say, well, they do that different and I do that different. I don't do it like that. Yeah, well, it's cool. But what about God? What about him? What about even when it's different, we get back to what's common? Even when it's a struggle, we remember that it was God that brought us together. If you are here tonight, if you're here tonight and you came without seeking God, then everything I say to you and everything you learn in this environment, it's gone. It fell on the hard place. Right? It fell on the hard place. Because you have to get yourself ready to receive. You better hear me. You have to get yourself ready to receive. Just like I get myself ready to communicate the word to you, you got to get yourself ready to receive the word. In other words, you got to till some hard places. And a lot of times you got to confess to God, well, this is what I want. And how many of us show up on Sunday or show up on Wednesday night and say, you know what, God, I need to hear from you. I want to hear from you. My ears are open. My heart is open. Speak to me. Guess what? When you do that, it'll change how you engage in the moment. It'll change how you listen. It'll change how you're viewing it all. There is no way that you can remain the same. If you say to God, I want to hear from you and speak to me, he'll give you exactly what you asked for. Somebody said, now, Lord, speak to me. Watch it. Watch it. It says, you ye, in verse number 9, ye are God's husbandry. Yeah. You see that? I looked at that over and over again. I said, husbandry. And so I went to look at the original language of that, and it blew my mind. It says, you are God's farmland. You are his farm land. And this farmland is cultivated. This land, it's cultivated. He says, when I view you, the reason I can't have you disconnected from one another is because there's something that I'm trying to plant that other people need to receive, but if it's not growing, then how then can somebody else benefit from the growth that I need to take place? I know you thought you were growing for your own spiritual journey. Wait a minute. No, you are not only growing for your journey, but you are growing to make sure that somebody else can eat from the place that you grew. Somebody holler, God is not selfish. He said, you are the husbandry, farm, cultivated land, a place of growth. When we labor together, that's our objective, is to grow. And while we're growing, other people grow around us because we're growing. You do know that if you don't grow, you will interfere with somebody else's. Come here. If you sit here week in and week out and you're not growing, the only thing you know how to do is to make sure don't nobody else grow. And it's amazing because people who are carnal don't want to see other people grow. And so that's why they have so much negative verbiage. That's why they have so much negative energy. That's why they won't get connected. That's why they refuse to do it the right way. Why? Because I don't want to see nobody else grow. Well, why is that? Because I'm not growing. You've got to be able to identify individuals who've decided that where they are is where they're going to be. And you got to tell them, you frustrated with me. Why? Because I'm growing. You ought to get you some of this. No, you ought to get you some. You ought to get you some growth. You ought to get a little prayer in your life. You ought to get a little love in your life. You ought to get a little peace in your life. You ought to get a little joy in your life. You ought to get a little word in your life. But the minute they don't have it, when they don't have it, they don't want to see you with it. You thought that was just a natural sense, huh? That people don't want to see you make it. They don't want to see you have stuff. You thought that was just natural. It's spiritual too. There's some people who don't want to see you with it. And so they'll try to rob it from you with their energy. But you have to be able to let come out of you what's been planted in you. And so when they get foolish, you say, no weapon formed against me. Shall prosper. Every tongue that rises itself up against me shall be condemned. You have to remind them, I'm the head and not the tail, above only and not beneath. You have to remind them what's on the inside of you. But if the word hasn't been cultivated, you don't have anything to put out. Got to ask yourself, what's in me? He said, you are God. I'm moving. You are God's husbandry. Right? And then we go from, look at this. We talked about this farmland and this cultivated land, right? And then he says, ye are God's building, right? Cultivated, right? Land, farmland, this is where God is going to plant in you, right? Then when I look at the word building, it talked about architect, right? Talked about architect, right? Husbandry. Talked about this farmland being cultivated, right? Cultivatable, right? And then when I got to building, it talks about architect. And when I think about somebody who's an architect, the first thing they do before they build anything is that they draw it. Oh gosh. Oh gosh. Because anytime you're going to build anything of consequence, you want to have a plan. The word consequence there talks about of importance, significance, right? If you're going to build something that's of consequence, that's of importance, guess what? You want to plan first. And what the architect does in his plans, you better watch this, what he does is in his plans, it's not just a drawing, but it's also dimensions. It's also weight. Because they need to know how many people are going to be in the area. And so we need to make sure that it has enough foundation to hold certain amount of people. But not only that, the safety of the building, if a fire breaks out, how do we protect people who may be in the midst of the fire? All I'm trying to do is tell you is that God has strategically designed you, and that's why you're able to survive some storms and some fires and some floods, because he's designed you. He gave you enough weight. Other people died in what you went through, but he knew your capacity because he just strategically put you together. Touch yourself and say, I'm strategically made. I'm sorry, I'm getting happy because I refuse to have the adversary try to attack my body while I'm teaching. Thank you, son. So he's the building architect. That's what he's done. And so he knew the capacity. He says, when I build you, I'm going to make sure that everything comes your way. You can handle it. Because you are strategically made. It ain't going to kill you. It ain't going to wipe you out. It ain't going to destroy you. I'm trying to speak prophetically in your life. It ain't going to mess you up. You ain't going to lose your mind. It's going to all come together. Why? Because you were built for it. Touch yourself and say, I'm built for this. You are God's building. Notice the progression. Notice the progression. Notice the progression. Because we got to start. If you're going to build something, you got to have some plans. But I like it because you got to have somewhere to build it. Yeah, you got to have somewhere to build it. Now, if you building stuff that ain't significant, you don't need no plans, right? If you building something that ain't, you build a little doghouse or something, you don't need no plans. Just put that together how you want it, right? But anything that you're going to build that's of significance, write it. Make it plain. And make sure you got the right stuff in the plan. So whatever comes up, right, you say, yeah, no big deal. This building is still staying. Because we put the right material for the right circumstances. Yeah, yeah. And so God has given you your permit to build what you need to build. Because you do know the other part of architect is that the plans got to be approved by whatever governing authority in which is over the place where you're going to build. You do know when you build something of consequence, it takes paperwork before it takes a hammer and nail. Oh, well, Johnson, direct me to the paperwork. Oh, what's wrong with you? I didn't. I thought I told you where your paperwork was. Oh, somewhere in these 66 books. Yeah, that's some paperwork. And if you keep reading the paperwork, keep getting the paperwork on the inside of you, and keep confessing the paperwork, then all of a sudden, God will make sure that the plan is clear. You are his husbandry. You are God's building. But you got to remember that if you ever want to mess up the plan, stick with your carnal thinking, because it's guaranteed to stop you from building. It's guaranteed to stop you from growing. Who are you in God? That is the question for you to answer on a daily basis. Who am I in God? I'm a laborer with him. And that's why I can love you, because our connection is him. Come on, give God some praise. I'm glad to Thank you so much for being a part of these 30 minutes of teaching. Bless you. Sister Johnson is coming with our announcements. I love you guys so much. As always, thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of our ministry. Somebody got a question for me? Yes, sir. Go ahead, Red. Are we still live? All right, go ahead, Red. We don't have to be. I'm okay. It's good if we're not. Yes, sir. The question was, how do you stop your own